Hello there. How's things? Feel like it's been a little bit of a while. I've been doing lots of live speaking events. Well, I say live, still they're all pretty much online. It's rare that you get to do them in person here in Hong Kong, at least for me it seems. But there have been all those things going on, which means I haven't been doing many videos. I haven't been popping up on LinkedIn with anything other than you can come and catch me at this particular time and date at this particular place, which is not great if you're not in my time zone, let's put it that way. But in the tech world, a lot's been going on. We've had the judgment in the Epic versus Apple case, which was interesting, but I think that's going to run, quite frankly. But a lot of interesting developments in terms of data here in this part of the world, in Hong Kong and in China. And I want to talk about something called data sovereignty. Now, before I do that, a while ago I did a video about technology companies in China. I think it was about what is China doing to its tech industry. And we've seen a lot going on in just the space of the last month. Crackdown isn't too strong a word, I think, in terms of tech companies, which seems to be focused on the amount of data that they hold. We've also seen, of course, this GDPR challenge to TikTok in the EU. It's a concern that the data that TikTok is collecting is being shipped off to somewhere else. Couldn't possibly think where that might be without following EU rules. We'll see what happens there. But the big news really is what China is doing in terms of its tech industry. So lots of things. We've already heard about Didi being targeted in terms of the data it holds, the ongoing battle in terms of Alibaba and what's going on there and how they're essentially, seems like they're being neutered, split up, and really, I think they're using antitrust as a reason behind it. But again, I think it's the data they hold. Tencent, I think, is going to be next, but certainly Tencent has been affected by the ban on online video games for minors. Not an outright ban, but they're only really allowed to play for an hour a day at weekends, and it's a set hour where I'm sure the servers will crash. For me, as a gamer, if you ever watch these videos, you know that I do like the occasional video game. I don't play online very often because I am generally rubbish at the game itself. Is that an understatement? No, it's probably not an understatement. I'm normally terrible. But as a kid, that would have destroyed me. And I do wonder what it's doing to the esports industry in China. Now, some of this is protecting the youth, I suppose, from playing too many games, which I'm sure lots of people wish that they could do to their kids. But again, I think a lot of it is about the data that's being collected. So I want to talk about something called data sovereignty. Now, by the way, too much typing, I've hurt my hand again. What is data sovereignty? Now, imagine, I suppose, a big wall around a country, around a jurisdiction, where sovereignty means you control what's going on within your country, within your borders. And there's a lot of talk about protecting the sovereignty of jurisdictions. Heaven knows we hear a lot about it here in Hong Kong in terms of what's happening in Hong Kong and in China. But data sovereignty is a bit different. And if you imagine, and I've talked about this before, imagine the internet as this great, free, open place, sort of what it was like in the 90s when I was a young whippersnapper using the internet and thinking, this is so cool, I can email someone on the other side of the world and they get my message almost instantaneously. Remember, this is the time before we had Google, before we had Skype, certainly we didn't have any video calling. It seems like a different world now. Data sovereignty kind of takes that and says, well, we like the fact there's all this data going around the world and that's very exciting, but we want to control completely the data that goes into our borders, outside our borders. Data we create or relates to us as a jurisdiction, as a country, we own that and we want to make sure we keep it safe. We want to make sure that we decide what happens to that, and if someone else wants to use it, well, sorry, they're going to have to apply to do it within our rules. Now, we see a bit of data sovereignty in personal data protection laws. GDPR, there's a big element of that in terms of you need consent to transfer data to most places, or you need to make sure at least that they have the same protections in place that you have in your home jurisdiction. But China has one is already in force, just passed 2 new data protection laws. They're very different, but they do deal with the issue of data sovereignty, and they very much do deal with how I think it's going to be harder to deal with Chinese data if you're a company who isn't based in China. I mean, it's hard enough in China as it is, but it's going to get more difficult for anyone else. Let's have a look at what they are. So the first law I want to talk about is the China Data Security Law. That is in force now, is in force as we speak. Now, you may remember a few years ago, back in 2017, China passed its cybersecurity law, and we all got very worried, thinking, what does this mean for business in China? Is it going to be the case that we have to store all of our data originating in China in China? Do we need new servers? Are we worried about what can go in and out of the country? And to be honest, for those who were not based in China, it became a bit of a sort of a damp squib. It wasn't the scary thing that people thought it was. But the data security law, I think, is more scary. This separates core state data and important data and applies protections to them. It applies anywhere in the world and essentially means that data that is collected in China that is either important, and this hasn't been properly defined, but I assume it means everything that isn't core state data, which essentially is data relevant on national security grounds, has to stay within China. You have to deal with the Cyberspace Administration if you want to transfer that data out. This means that for international businesses, you've got to think, what data do you actually have? Unlikely you've got core state data. It's unlikely you're running any critical infrastructure, but important data, given that we don't yet have a definition, could be anything. I mean, you ask someone what data is important, you're going to get a different answer depending on what happens. The key thing here, though, is national security. These two words, which we hear constantly here in Hong Kong and you hear constantly in China. The law is very much about protecting the security of Chinese data. Not necessarily personal data, there's something else to do that, but data that relates to the interests of the state, the interests of China as a nation, data that they want to exert sovereignty over. It means essentially you can't transfer that outside of China without hitting a few conditions which are quite vague in the law as it stands. Essentially you can't transfer that data out without satisfying the requirements of the Cyberspace Administration. So you've got to basically prove to the government that you're allowed to transfer this data where you want to transfer it to. So, is it going to affect international businesses? Yes, it is. But there are a few things that really are a bit of a problem if you're operating in China. Now, the big one for me is that you are not allowed under this new law to provide any data to foreign law enforcement officials. This is relating to this data that is originating in China without getting the relevant consents. So you've got to get permission first. Now, some of this I think relates to the crackdown on sanctions against China, giving data to essentially foreign states. It's sort of a making sure your data stays within this state and other states don't see it. Again, the national security buzzword. But think, if you are an international business, how much data you do have to show to law enforcement officials or just officials in general. Again, it's very vaguely drafted in the wording, in order to do business with China. You're thinking, Paul, what are you speaking about? Of course you don't have to provide data. But no, a lot of organisations have requirements to report essentially any incident of potential bribery. We have the Bribery Act in the UK, for example. There are similar laws in other jurisdictions. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for example, in the US. If you have to supply data, if a request is said, oh, we want details of the contracts you have, the dealings you've had with this company who's based in China, the data you have there, you cannot provide it. And normally you're compelled to provide it, but you cannot provide it without getting the state in China to agree. This means, and I've used this phrase before, you're once again between a rock and a hard place. It's like the anti-sanctions law all over again. So what do? You have to get permission. If permission isn't forthcoming, then what do you do? If you are, for example, sourcing goods in Xinjiang, which is a place where people are very concerned about potentially slavery going on, if you have an issue there, your law enforcement body, your officials in the UK may say, well, to comply with your obligations under, for example, the Anti-Slavery Act, you need to provide details of who your supplier is, who you're sourcing this information from. You can't provide it to them under this new law. And you can see, while it seems like an innocuous provision at first, you can see first you won't be allowed to transfer this data out of China, then you can't provide it. Can you continue to do business in China on this basis? This is the question that lots of organisations at this very moment in time are having to ask. And honestly, I don't have an answer. At the moment, I'm trying to help people navigate it, saying, look, the law is still drafted in vague terms. There'll be further explanation of what it means. We have to wait to see how it's implemented in practice, even though it's already enforced. But we will have to wait and see. I assume that the law enforcement officials they were talking about, I mean, think about, for example, the Huawei Meng Wanzhou case, I always mispronounce the name. I'm sure that's what it was ultimately targeting, but it cuts across so many different aspects of anyone doing business in any jurisdiction. You often have to tell your home jurisdiction if there is a fear that you may be breaking a law in that jurisdiction when you're operating overseas. Suddenly you need permission to do that. You may even have what's the phrase I'm looking for? Tip-off, that's it. You may even have tip-off restrictions in that law that you're not allowed to tell them that you're providing that data to a law enforcement official. You can see how it's going to be a massive, massive issue. Now, the law imposes other requirements too, some that actually you would welcome: a requirement to have data security in place, reporting obligations in the event of data breach, essentially all requirements to keep data safe within China. Again, data sovereignty doesn't just mean keeping it within borders, it means keeping it securely. But it also has penalties, and the penalties are quite wide-ranging. I'll have to read them out. So if you get something wrong, you can be hit with something called a rectification order. You can issue a warning saying don't transfer this data again, don't misuse this data, don't lose this data, keep this data securely. You can face a fine up to 10 million renminbi, which is small fry, I suppose, from a GDPR point of view, but still quite scary if you're a small organisation there. You can also have your business suspended, any permits or licenses removed, and of course you can face criminal liability, as you often can under Chinese law. So this is a worry if you are a foreign company operating in China and you're handling Chinese data. We've already mentioned the law enforcement thing, but any issue of whether that data is secure could essentially face you for dealing with criminal charges. Again, a worry. Now, the thing about the China data security law is it doesn't really cover personal data. But there is a law coming to force. At the moment, and I'm being perfectly blunt, Hong Kong's personal data protections are pretty poor. Chinese ones are separated around lots of different pieces of legislation, and they've never been brought into one place. The cybersecurity law didn't do that, the data security law doesn't do that. But the personal information law will do that. And this is coming into force in November. It's been passed, we're waiting to see how it actually happens in practice. There is the personal information protection law, it is, and I would liken it to China's version of the GDPR. It's very, very similar in its scope. Have a look at some of the provisions. Now, lots of these look very, very familiar to anyone who has ever dealt with the GDPR. So the key provisions are, for example, requirement to have informed consent to process, collect and process personal information, so personal data, very GDPR-esque. You've got to make sure you're collecting it for a specific purpose. There are rules regarding sensitive personal information. You can't retain the data for longer than you deem necessary. You need separate consent for cross-border transfer, although that consent is typically not the users, it's actually the Cyberspace Administration. It's more the state consent than the user consent. A right to have data corrected, and a requirement to notify in the event of data breaches. Now, the actual details of what this is going to look like have not been fleshed out. The articles of the Personal Information Protection Law, again, as with many Chinese laws, they feel like a statement of intent rather than how it's going to work in practice. But they are there, and they are something you need to comply with, because, much like the GDPR, this new law imposes its own fines, its own penalties, and they're not to be sniffed at. I think, again, another page from the GDPR handbook. So these fines are 50 million renminbi, or 5% of your annual turnover for the previous year. Doesn't that just feel like the GDPR? It's got, I mean, potentially it's a higher fine, and depending what your turnover is, but it's quite a scary thing to face. But there's also, in addition to that, a suspension of business. So you may find you can no longer operate, whether you're an overseas company or one operating in China. You can essentially find your business go down the tubes because you're not looking after Chinese personal data. You can face a personal fine if you're an individual in charge. That goes up to 1 million renminbi. And again, we have potential criminal liability. Now, these two laws, you've got the data security law and the personal information protection law. It's easy to be scared by them at first, and I think if you're an overseas organisation, there is some good cause to be. But if you are based in China, they are in many ways a good thing. They do take elements that we have in the rest of the world, firstly about protecting national security, protecting state data, things like official secrets, that's the data security law. And then the personal information protection law, which really needs a catchier title, quite frankly, but there we go. It is very similar to the provisions in the GDPR. The problem is the effect of these laws together against the backdrop of what's happening in China in terms of the tech and data industries generally, mean that we have, think about it, when I mentioned data security before, it becomes a lot easier to take data into China than it is to push data out. This is similar, again, to the GDPR in the EU. The difference, however, is the EU applies only to personal data. The restrictions and the penalties predominantly are personal data related. The actual penalties for state data, they tend to be between different states. And whilst lots of jurisdictions have laws protecting that data, they're a bit more piecemeal. They're not as in-your-face protected as these two laws together. The personal information law makes sure that Chinese citizens' data are protected in China, but also makes it very difficult if you want to transfer it out. You will be required, if you are handling Chinese individuals' data, if you're selling to Chinese individuals, if you're doing anything with Chinese individuals, you will have to have a presence, a dedicated person appointed in China to make sure you comply with this data. Think of them as a data protection officer that you would have under the GDPR or any other data law. But you must have that. I'm sure we'll see a cottage industry build up in China where you can nominate someone to do that, in much the same way as you have to have someone when you're essentially hiring a Chinese employee, which is a whole other video and a whole other topic that's more complicated than something I can talk about. But it does mean that you're going to find challenges whenever you're just doing business on a day-to-day basis in China that involves Chinese data. And let's face it, all of it does. But the whole picture of it is a real, think of a wall going on. We already have the Great Firewall, so I won't use that analogy completely, but a great wall going up that now makes sure that Chinese data, the Great Firewall was often about data going into China. Now we have one that stops it coming out. Is it going to be a problem for the day-to-day person, much as when we had the GDPR and people were panicking, thinking, oh God, I'm going to face a massive, massive fine because I'm selling, I don't know, gadgets online or embroidery on Etsy or whatever. Thing is, I think it actually is. It will only affect the big players first, and I think the law initially will be used to go after people who are in some ways quite politicized as to how they want to target people in China. But it will have an impact as it comes into force and we see what happens. I do think, unlike the cybersecurity law, we will see these two laws make it more difficult for businesses to operate in China without really beefing up their compliance function in the territory. Now you may be wondering, certainly I was wondering, what does this mean for Hong Kong? Well, Hong Kong's data protection law still is pretty lousy, to be honest. We are getting a doxing amendment, which I talked about earlier, that is coming in. They've watered it down a little bit so that you can basically object if you don't have the power to remove doxing content and you won't go to jail. But that's it. If you post doxing content, whether or not harm is caused, then there is a chance you will face a big fine or go to jail. That's a topic of a whole other video. Beyond that, though, our law is something out of 1997 at best, which is a long time in data. However, I do note the Privacy Commissioner here in Hong Kong has posted the details of the new Chinese laws on the Privacy Commissioner's website. So I do wonder whether we'll find a similar law either enforced here, drafted especially, or whether it's just passed into law as the anti-sanctions law was supposed to be, but hasn't been yet. But we'll see. It is very, very interesting times. I mean, the concept of data sovereignty, which has been around for a long time, is now really coming to the fore. China, I think, is making its play to say, well, we are no longer going to be this free place where you can rely on us as a big market of consumers without having to put something back, without protecting the data of our consumers. They're also saying, you know what, there hasn't been very good protection of our individuals' data for a long time. But they're also saying we are going to make sure we have absolute control of any data that comes into or originates from our borders. And I think we're seeing a bit of a battle for that data as things go on. I could talk about state-sponsored hacking, cybersecurity issues. The law does account for some of those. Certainly you've got to make sure your cybersecurity protections are up to scratch. You should be doing that anyway. They're not really a part of that law. This law is really, I think, targeting those data companies within China who China thinks are misusing data, but also targeting those people who've been making a lot of money using Chinese data in the past. So we'll see how it pans out. Will it see an epoch change of companies thinking we can't trade with China anymore? Of course it won't. There's far too much money to be made, and I think for most people they're willing to jump through the various hoops. Liken it to GDPR, people complied. The world hasn't ended for most companies who are dealing with EU jurisdictions. I don't count the UK in that because they seem to be thinking about how much that's going to apply. I thought it wouldn't change, but we'll see. But that hasn't ended, and it won't end for China either. But I do think if you are dealing with them, you need possibly to take a look at this law, read it, think what does it mean, why is it so vague, and I will tell you that is by design, but then think about how you will comply with it when we get a bit more, I won't use meat on the bones because I'm vegetarian, a bit more, I don't know, plant-based food on the vegan bun. That doesn't work. Anyway, that's it for now. Plenty to think about. I am speaking next week at an Infratech event, but I'll be back with another video fairly soon. I'm still waiting, by the way, if you're wondering about the anti-sanctions law, which I mentioned earlier, that isn't enforced yet in Hong Kong. We're still waiting to see what it means. A lot of stuff going on and a lot of concern as to what that does. But I think data law coming out of China, I think data law in Hong Kong is going to be a big deal in the rest of this year. Just have to see what it looks like. Exciting times for everyone. Sometimes I don't know whether exciting is good, but maybe it is if you're a lawyer. Anyway, have a good one and take care.